Okay, so today we are going to talk about the sine and cosine graph. So let's begin by looking at the basic form of the sine graph. So we have y equals a sine of bx minus c plus d. Notice how we referred to the parentheses as the of. The parenthesis value is whatever we're taking the sine of. If there was no plus d, we wouldn't see parentheses around that value, but we need to be able to recognize that value when we see it. Just like we recognize what the log is of versus a number being added to the log. So let's talk about what these things do. The first thing I look at is the d value. The d value moves the middle line, the horizontal line that the graph is in the middle of, up or down. So it literally moves the graph up or down like we've seen in previous examples. The A out in front, the next piece that we look at, controls the amplitude. Remember from the previous section, we said that sine has a maximum on the y-axis of +1 and a minimum at -1. We call that the amplitude. And if we change this A number to anything other than 1, it would change the amplitude to that number. And if it was negative, you'd have the graph flipped upside down. So that leaves the of part, bx minus c. So the bx minus c, this portion controls the period and the phase shift when we do them both at the same time. Sine is a periodic function. It repeats itself. Every time you go around the unit circle, it repeats itself. So its initial period is from 0 to 2 pi. So to shift the period, what we do is we take bx minus c, set it equal to 0, solve for x, that's our new beginning, and then we take bx minus c again, set it equal to 2 pi, solve for x again, and that's our new end of the period. So once it's all graphed out, the graph of sine looks like the following. Starts from 0, goes to 2 pi, amplitude of a max at 1, minimum at -1, sine of 0 is 0, so we start at 0. We go up to the amplitude because the sine of pi over 2 is 1. Back to the middle, sine of pi is 0. Down to the amplitude, sine of 3 pi over 2 is -1. And back to 0, sine of 2 pi is 0. And now we've completed one rotation of the unit circle, so that's one period. Now the cosine graph behaves much the same way as the sine graph. It has the A, has the D, has the bx minus c. Its graph just looks a little different because cosine has different values. Cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. And the cosine of 2 pi is back at 1. We've completed one period. The way I always like to remember this, I use a little mnemonic. Let's bring back sine over here. Sine is middle, up, middle, down, middle. And cosine is up, middle, down, middle, up. Or cosine kind of makes that U shape. Okay, let's try a graph. Our first graph we have is y equals -1/2 sine x plus 3. We're just going to draw one period of the graph to show that we understand what we're talking about. The first one we look for is the middle, 3. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that. The middle is 3. I like to draw a dotted line for the middle so I can see where it is. Next thing we're going to look for is the amplitude. The amplitude's out in front of the sine, so our amplitude here is -1/2. That means from the middle line, which we placed at 3, our graph is going to go up 1/2, or to 3.5, and down 1/2, which would be 2.5. These are all things you have to label on your graph. You have to label the middle line, the maximum, and the minimum. Now, because the amplitude is negative, our graph is going to flip upside down. So normally graph starts at the middle, it goes up, back to the middle, down, back to the middle. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to go middle, down, middle, up, middle. That's just because of the negative. Okay, the last step is to find the period. So I take the parenthesis, which is simply x, set equal to 0, which is simply 0, and set it equal to 2 pi, which is simply 2 pi. So our graph period begins at 0 and ends at 2 pi. This should be of no surprise because the x value hasn't changed. Now, to be able to draw a graph properly, we need to mark 3 points. We have the end, 2 pi. We have 0. We got to go smack dab right in the middle, which would be pi. Middle of the middle, pi over 2. And middle again, which would be 3 pi over 2. And I'm just going to carry these lines to our dotted line, which is our acting as a middle. Okay, time to draw the graph. Going to switch colors here. So sine starts at the middle line. Because it's a negative amplitude, I'm going to go down 1/2, back to the middle. Notice how I'm filling in each of the points I marked earlier on the x-axis. Now I'm going to go up 1/2, because we're negative here, and back to the middle. And that completes my key points. All I need to do is connect them with that typical sine wave, like that. And that's one period, and I can keep drawing that same pattern again and again and again to get additional periods. So that is a basic sine graph where we change all of its key values. Let's look at cosine here. So y equals cosine of x over 3. Again, step 1, identify the middle. This one's quite simple. The middle is simply 0. There is no d value. Next up, identify the amplitude. The amplitude is simply 1 because there is no number given other than 1. So we can go ahead and label that. Our middle line is the x-axis. We go up to 1, and we go down to -1. So we have all that nicely labeled on our graph. So now we need to figure out the period. Well, our of part, x over 3, that's the part we need to set equal to the beginning of the period and the end of the period. Cosine's period begins at 0. So x over 3 equals 0. When we solve for x, that gives us our new beginning, which is x equals 0. Not much of a change. We do it again to find the end. X over 3 equals 2 pi because that's where the sine period ends. Solve for x, multiply by 3. X equals pi over 6. So this graph, this period this time, instead of ending at 2 pi, it's going to be stretched out to pi over 6. But I still draw the same hash marks. I draw the middle, which in this case would be 3 pi, the middle, and the middle. Okay, now I'm ready to do my key points here. So I'm going to switch to blue again. Cosine starts at the amplitude, goes to the middle, goes down to the amplitude, back to the middle, and then back up to where we started from at the amplitude. And we can connect them as best we can. Now, it should kind of curve into a peak at the endpoints. It's kind of hard to draw on this computer. Let's look at one last graph today. So we have y equals 3 sine of 2x minus pi over 3 minus 1. Looks complicated, but let's break it down into our same familiar patterns. So we start with the middle. Our middle value is the end there, -1. So our middle value is -1. I'm going to go ahead and mark that on my graph. And again, I'm going to use a dotted line for reference. So there we go. Dotted line for reference, check. Amplitude. Okay, look to the front of the graph equation. Amplitude is 3. So that means from my middle line, I'm going to go up 3, which would bring me to the value of 2. And then back to the middle line, I'm going to go down 3, which places me at -4. So I went up 3, 1, 2, 3, down 3, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, now it's time to find out what that period is. So the normal period of sine starts at 0, ends at 2 pi. So I'm going to set the parentheses part equal to 0. So 2x minus pi over 3 equals 0. Add pi over 3 to both sides. Divide by 2. X equals pi over 6. So my graph is going to start at pi over 6. Again, to find the end, 2x minus pi over 3 equals 2 pi, because that's where the graph normally ends. Solve for x. We add pi over 3 to both sides. Divide by 2. So x equals 5 pi over 6. So my graph is going to begin this time at pi over 6 and end at 5 pi over 6. I'm going to go ahead and mark these points. So I'm going to mark the beginning point, mark the end point, mark the middle of the middle, and the middle of the middle. And I'm going to carry these points down onto my reference line so I can see them. Okay, now we're ready to draw a sign. I'm going to switch out to my blue pen. Sign starts at the middle line. I'm going to begin it where our period begins at pi over 6. Then at the next point, we're going to go up all the way to the amplitude, back down to the middle for my next tick mark, all the way down to the amplitude, and back to my reference middle line. And then I simply can connect these points like so, and now I've successfully drawn one period of sine. So that is graphing sine and cosine. So to recap, find your middle, find the amplitude, mark those points, and then you set your parentheses equal to 0. Solve for x, that's where you begin your graph. You set your parentheses equal to 2 pi. Solve for x, that's where you end your graph. Okay, so that will do it for today.